Wow, this is so cool. Grandpa, Dad says you used to work on these train cars back then. Is that true?
I did. In fact, I was a steward on this car right here. And my granddaddy worked on this car too, when Mr. Charles E. Perkins was the president of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Mr. Perkins treated my grandfather real nice, but he wasn't willing to support the black union, or any union for that matter. And he wasn't much into integration. My granddaddy wasn't much into getting involved in politics. He was just happy he had a job. And it was as fine a job that a black man could have at the turn of the century. There was always a fine chef on this car. Mr. Perkins would always have his private secretary with him. Mr. Johnson was his name. I was told that he was a fine enough gentleman. Always kept to himself, not too much trouble. By the time I was working on the number 96, that was about 1958. The best part of this job was Chef Williams. Man, could that man cook a meal. And at the end of the line, we had permission to take home any leftovers. Those days, right after we got home, we ate mighty good.
Well, it sure is a pretty train car.
You see this wood? Honduran mahogany and quarter sawn oak. They spared no expense when they built this car. When was that? Back in 1886? My gosh, the parties we would have on this car. They would sleep up to 12 passengers, and these folks knew how to throw a party. Chef Williams used to whine and complain about trying to serve so many out of such a small kitchen. But I think he really enjoyed enjoying his fine cooking.
So, Grandpa, how long were you gone? Daddy says that you were gone for about a week or two at a time. Grandpa, Daddy said that he missed you.
We were already living in Denver, but I was still working on a line that took us up to Minneapolis and St. Paul. We had a lot of stops along the way, and I could have been gone for a week or two at a time. I tell you what though, I guarantee you, your daddy didn't miss me as much as I missed being home with my family.
So, when did you move to Denver?
We had been living on the south side of Chicago, and my granddaddy had been working for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. He had a friend who was telling him about a new union, the Protective Order of Dining Car Waiters and Porters. He said that a union could change everything, and it did too. We lived in Chicago until about 1945, when your great-grandpa heard of a man named A. Philip Randolph, who was working on putting together a new union he called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. You see, in the early 30s, a national union, the Protective Order of Dining Car Waiters and Porters, was formed. The Denver District, Local 465, was established in 1934. That's when my daddy started thinking about moving us out west to Denver. He heard of a new neighborhood that was thriving. An all-black neighborhood. A nice community. A great nightlife filled with some of the best jazz in the world. It took us a while, but in 1945, we were in Denver, living in Five Points, the Harlem of the West. Now, my daddy was in his prime when we moved to Denver. He must have been around 35 years old. Now, I was 15, just old enough to know that Five Points was the place to be for black folks. The Rossonian Hotel. What a place that was. Duke Ellington played there. Count Basie. Ella Fitzgerald. Anybody who was anybody wanted to play at the Smithsonian. There is a story about a famous writer named Jack Kerouac. Ever hear of him?
Didn't he write that weird book, On the Road?
That's the one. Well, his adventures brought him through 5 Points. He spent the night carousing and listening to music. By the end of the night, he confessed, "I wish I was a Negro."
But what made 5 Points so special? Why did all the railroad workers want to move there?
Well, Jamel, this was a time when Negroes were not allowed to integrate with whites. We were not welcomed in white nightclubs, even when black entertainers were performing. So we created our own neighborhood, and we were styling. You see, the porters and waiters on the railroad were traveling all across the country. So we were exposed to the latest fashions, the latest styles, sounds, and stories. And we had some of the best jobs for blacks in the country. We had money to spend, and we spent it. 5 Points boasted the finest food, the finest nightclubs, the finest nightlife, and some of the best entertainment in downtown Denver. 5 Points was the thing in the 40s and 50s. But in fact, we couldn't keep the whites out of our neighborhood. Well, funny thing, we couldn't go to their clubs, but they would always come to ours. They had the money, they wanted to spend it in our clubs. We were more than happy to take it.
But why did all the railroad workers live there?
Because we were close to Union Station. Denver was a major passenger line hub. We'd hop on a streetcar, be at Union Station in a few minutes, and it was our neighborhood. We shopped at each other's stores. We ate at each other's restaurants. We worked for equal rights and equal pay together as a community. Now, across from the Smithsonian, there was the Fraternal Club of Dining Car Waiters and Porters. There was a gentleman who worked at the Denver office, and his name was George Housing. You could always find George at the club, and he was always willing to talk to you about matters that affected our lives. If you ever wanted to find a comrade who hadn't been through town for a while, we had a bulletin board where you could inquire about the whereabouts or make arrangements to meet up with an old friend. This was a members-only club. Outsiders were not welcomed. We looked after our own. We took a lot of pride in our jobs. We knew we were the envy of our friends, and we gave the best service that you could find. We learned from the best. We were part of the Fred Harvey Company, which served the California Limited Railroad. The California Limited made its first run in 1892 and was withdrawn from service in 1954, giving it the longest tenure of any train on the Chicago-Los Angeles run. The Fred Harvey Company made its mark and set a standard of service that continued throughout the heyday of passenger train service. I remember when one of our own, Freddie Gomez, in 1962, got the job of steward on the Union Pacific. No black man had ever been a steward. That was a breakthrough. That was a celebration. Times changed, Jamel. It was a great time, the 40s, the 50s, and well into the 60s. But times were changing. The interest in traveling by railroad started to fade. Planes became more popular after World War II. Cars and highways made traveling long distance much easier. Jobs on the railroad were were fading away. People started moving out of Five Points, selling and renting their homes. And actually, civil rights was part of the downfall of Five Points too. It made it possible for blacks to integrate into white neighborhoods. As opportunities opened up, jobs opened up, and blacks became more welcome to live where they wanted to live in Denver and the suburbs. Five Points lost its appeal as the place where blacks wanted to live. With renting came drugs and crime. The pride of the neighborhood was vanishing, and it became dangerous for young families to live in Five Points.
So you're saying that progress brought down 5 points?
I guess in a way, yes. Maybe someday there will be interest in the 5 points again. But it won't be waiters or porters to prop up that neighborhood. Those days, I'm afraid, are gone for good. The heyday of the passenger train, those days are behind us.
So, were the dining cars the only place that blacks could get jobs on the railroad?
And there were others. There were engineers, there were track layers. Have you ever heard of a man named Elijah McCoy?
Who?
Girl, what do they teach you at that school of yours? Well, how about the real McCoy?
Yeah, sure. The real deal, right?
Do you know where it comes from?
No.
Elijah McCoy was an inventor. He developed many appliances for the railroad. One of his early inventions was an automatic oiling device, which eliminated the time-consuming need to stop and oil the rods of steam engines. Others tried to copy McCoy's oiling device, but they always came up short. The mechanical departments of most railroads knew how effective McCoy's invention was. They requested that their purchasing departments order only the real McCoy.
That was a great story. Grandpa, do you miss the railroad?
That's a great big question, young lady. The world has changed. Denver has changed. 5 Points has really changed. Much of the change has been for the best. Some is hard to watch. My father tells a story about when he was on a run and an ignorant passenger yelled at my father, "Hey, nigger." My father came out from behind a bar and decked him. He was suspended for 30 days, but he told my mother it's a few paychecks compared to self-respect. Martin Luther King was assassinated, but his work never stopped. Robert Kennedy was murdered. He was one of our great pioneers for civil rights. We've come a long way. We have a long way to go. We've gone to the moon, but we still have a hard time with self-respect and human compassion. I hope, young lady, that in your lifetime, we figure out tolerance for one another. When dignity is a part of being, not an aspiration.
I hope so too, Grandpa.
Well, that's it, lady. We need to get you home and get you to bed. You have school tomorrow.